certainly as a kid, if I didn't get an A in something, I got a B plus in something, or I spelled something wrong in a test, I would be punished pretty severely for it. I would be beaten for it. And so in adulthood, I thought that my worth, my inherent worth, was tied to success.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is the writer and radio producer, Stephanie Foo. If you're an avid podcast listener, you probably know her work on This American Life, Snap Judgment, as well as 99% Invisible and Reply All and Nancy, just to name a few. And now she's written a book that's both a memoir of growing up in an abusive and neglectful environment, and it's also an explainer on complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that's not as well known as it should be, though its effects may in fact be quite broad. The book is called What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma, and I am so glad to have its author joining me today. Stephanie Foo, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
The book, as I've said, is many things. We start off in your childhood, experiencing your relationship with your parents when you're quite young and growing up. Later, we're in the office with your therapist. It's different therapists, in fact. We're also at work with you, going through some very tough times. There seem to be many places we could have entered this story, this book. How did you decide to start the book in the painful place where you did?
I think it originally did not start with my childhood, or it started very briefly with my childhood. I think it was only about maybe 20 pages long or something like that. And when I turned that into my editor, I really wanted the book to not be a trauma memoir. I did not want it to focus on my childhood. I wanted the vast majority of it to take place in the healing aspect of it, of me as an adult, because the book is mostly about how to heal from complex PTSD. And so it goes through many different treatments, and it goes through, the effects of my childhood as an adult and how it's persisted in my life. But my editor was essentially like, we're not going to be able to buy into why you're healing and what you're healing from unless you really explain what happened to you. And so, my childhood only comprises about the first 50 pages or so. Book is 350 pages. So it's 300 pages of me as a grown person. But I needed to give that information in order to sort of have the reader understand what it was that I was spending this entire book healing from.
In constructing the book in this way, because it is unique in its construction, as you say, the emotional impact of those 50 pages, it's more than its page count. I felt reading it. Were there any other books you could look to as a model for putting together this kind of chimera where you really wanted to explain and you wanted to heal and study the healing, but needed this biographical thing in the beginning? And it felt to me kind of unprecedented, though it didn't read like, it read fine, but it was only afterwards looking back at it that I thought, wow, what a unique animal this is.
Yeah, I think I don't know any books like it, honestly. And that's why I wanted to write it because I couldn't find that book. I read a lot of trauma memoirs that focused mostly on the childhood, and I read a bunch of like very scientific, dry trauma books that focused on the adult healing, but not from a first person perspective, more from a scientific perspective. So I wanted to bring all of those elements together.
You write that you were an unpleasant person in college. I think you used harsher language than that, but you have this self-awareness. about emerging from your childhood as a person that you really didn't like very much. And it seemed to me you came to therapy really early from this desire to change. And I wanted to ask you if you have a sense of that person that you were then, who was deliberately setting out to create that inflection point in their life.
You mean the person, like when I was 22 and sort of coming out of my trauma and seeking out therapy or like long-term therapy for the first time?
Yeah. I mean, I look back on, I mean, and maybe this is probably just revealing too much about myself, but I think of, like, for me, it was, the stitching kind of came out of my personality in my 30s, where I realized, oh, I'm going to have to deal with my stuff. Certainly I was unpleasant at 22. Like, I think that's a matter of public record to some extent. And it struck me that you would have had the insight and the drive to seek change in that way.
Yeah, I think the real catalyst for that was being in a relationship when I was about 22, 23, and struggling in that relationship because I was like, I was very dissociated at that point, I think. I was focusing a lot on work. I don't know if I was really accessing a lot of vulnerable feelings very much. And the guise in which I went to my first therapy session was, I want to figure out how to love. And honestly, there's this idea, right, that your first therapy session is sort of replicated for all of the subsequent ones. And now I really do feel like my entire therapy journey has been essentially learning how to love and be loved. But I also have a lot of empathy and sympathy and generous feelings to that 22-year-old because she was really strong, and that dissociation existed because she was trying so hard to heal and to be normal and to be successful. And that strength that she must have possessed to come out of such a lonely and traumatic childhood and survive and stay alive and maintain relationships. I think that required a tremendous amount of willpower. And so, yeah, even though I was a very complicated person back then, I am still very proud of that person.
Could you set the stage a little bit, just so the listeners who haven't read the book yet can kind of understand that at 22, sort of professionally, where were you at? Certainly in a relationship that you wanted to make a real go of.
Yeah. So I had managed to graduate in 2.5 years at 20, because I sort of wanted to, I wanted to get away from my childhood and make a name for myself and become successful, become a journalist really quickly. And I did manage to do that at 22. I was a producer for a national public radio show, Snap Judgment. I was working 70-hour weeks, producing often 30 minutes of content every week. And just sort of on my own, independent, trying to survive in this world. And yeah, I just entered a relationship with a person that I was afraid to be vulnerable around and to care for, but I wanted to figure out how to make that work.
Your ambition to like launch out of childhood and into adulthood is a real like driving force, and it seems that it seems to propel you a good distance. But you also have this, you express this awareness of reaching the top of your kind of professional reaching the peak of a professional accomplishment, and looking around, specifically in New York, and kind of seeing the dread. I think you call it the dread as
Mhm.
something that's powering a bunch of people everywhere. And I thought it was an interesting insight to see that you're at the top of the pile, and everyone else who is kind of at the top of their pile is powered by this negative feeling. I wonder, do we have the wrong idea about what success looks like?
I mean, I certainly had the wrong idea about what success looks like. I don't know if I can speak for everyone. I don't know if everyone is driven by the same like intense fear that I was driven by.
Mm.
But speaking for myself, as a child, um, especially in an Asian American community,
Mm-hmm.
success was the thing that would erase our trauma and our parents' trauma and make our immigration story a success. And so certainly as a kid, if I didn't get an A in something, I got a B plus in something, or I spelled something wrong in a test, I would be punished pretty severely for it. I would be beaten for it. And so in adulthood, I thought that my worth, my inherent worth was tied to success. I think, because I came from such a dangerous, troubled place, that I thought probably my sanity even was tied to my success. Like the more successful I could be, the more sane and healed I would look. And I had tied that to my happiness as well. And so, but of course, that means that I would produce something, or I would get a job or whatever that people liked. And, it would make the rounds on the internet and it would get tweeted around a lot. And that would be great for a day. But what happens the day after that? Well, you're back to square one. You got to do it all over again. And so it was this constant pressure. And at a certain point, I could not take that pressure anymore. And I also, had to grapple with the fact that I was being a workaholic in order to dissociate and not in order to not grapple with the issues that I had left unresolved from my childhood, and feeling sort of sad, or the dread is an amorphous feeling. It was just sort of a weird, bad feeling that I couldn't quite place. And I was like, if I could just work really hard, then the dread will go away. And I started to realize that the dread was not a normal feeling that I should have in between stories, that I should experience potentially more joy or relaxation. And so, yeah, I certainly think that having a measure of happiness and success that is so tied to capitalistic output is not sustainable long term, or it was not for me.
Mm. And you alluded to cultural and racial identity as part of the mix of your conception of success. And there was a section in the book I thought that was really striking, and I was riveted as you looked into this picture we have of success of high achieving children, and you went right at whether this is an artifact of a culture, of is this a negative aspect of your Asian American culture, and it seemed like scary work, because as you wrote it seemed like you were open to the possibility that you were going to see something really ugly and really tough to look at.
Tough to look at, in that I belong to a community that was racked by trauma rather than an individual family that was suffering from trauma.
Yeah, well, the tough part would have been that it was bound up in racist attitudes that required like unpicking.
Oh, I see.
Right. Like, I think you tie it back to how the myth of the model immigrant kind of drives a thing. And then it's a question of, then who are we as a community if we draw value from this perception that has on its other side this anxiety that turns into all kinds of different manifestations of trauma.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that fear of vulnerability. There was this culture of shame growing up, of that we just had to appear to be perfect, get perfect grades, appear to be like the perfect model, like you said, immigrants. But the problem with the model minority, of course, is that it really flattens a population. And I don't know of any population that is perfect and is just functioning absolutely well in America. Certainly not a population that is that has one generation prior escaped things like the Vietnam War and the Korean War, and in my case, the Malian Emergency and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And of course, our parents underwent a lot of trauma, and they passed that down and intergenerationally and culturally. And I was in a community that suffered from a tremendous amount of trauma and mental health challenges. And that was all invisible because we generally got good grades and because the teachers saw us as the model minority. And so we weren't resourced, and we were struggling. Many of us, not all of us, of course, but me and many people I know were struggling tremendously. And we weren't able to be cared for in the way children should be cared for. And I think that was the most painful thing probably throughout my journey, was just learning about the ways in which institutions and families and individuals failed me because they failed to witness what in retrospect seemed pretty obvious, some really serious child abuse. And who would I have been if I had been resourced earlier, if I had gotten help earlier, if I had been taught earlier that I deserved love and kindness and not to be like brutally beaten and neglected,
Yeah.
That's the painful part, I think, is who would I be if I had gotten a little bit more help?
Right. I mean, because as you, I want to talk about this, it's kind of a grief, isn't it? The person you weren't, the person we don't get to be, when we experience trauma, and that creates that kind of break.
Certainly, like, I was comparing myself as an adult against populations of people who came from a lot more privilege than me, who communicated very differently than my parents communicated, or that my community communicated. And so I think wanting to fit into a very white, upper middle class sort of, Ivy League environment, coming from where I was coming, probably exacerbated the dread quite a bit, because I'm not that person. But I think the true driving force of the dread was not necessarily like the grief of what I could not have been. I think the dread was the result of unresolved trauma and just triggers and feeling. I was taught that I was not worthy of love, and I think I needed to learn what it meant to love myself in order to ultimately calm the dread.
Yeah. So you were interviewed for The Guardian by Poppy Noor, who says up front that she has a C-PTSD, complex PTSD diagnosis, and we're well into this interview. And I should say up front, I first heard the term complex PTSD in a session with my therapist. We don't have to get in too much into that, but that's part of what resonated with me about your book was there were commonalities I could see. There was sort of solving riddles in my own mind, and so I have to ask you, given that your search for books that explain the condition and other experts in the area was a little thin, are you now just seeing the CPTSD folks coming out of the woodwork as you have now written this book? And having gone through the experience of looking for resources on this condition and knowing it was fairly thin, and knowing that you now have this book out, that you are now on the short list of books that explain what this is all about. Is that beginning to happen yet? The CPTSD folks everywhere you turn?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great because, I mean, if you've read my book, when I first was diagnosed, I tweeted about it and I posted on Facebook, and I was like, does anybody out there have this? And nobody responded. And one person tweeted back, like, sounds shitty. I was like, yeah, I think it is shitty. And I felt like completely alone and a freak. And I wrote this book so that other people would not feel that way, so that other people would understand an individual's struggle to heal and provide them with real techniques and real hope. But ultimately, yeah, I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of people with complex PTSD reaching out after, and I'm like, oh, look, there we are, just as I suspected. I don't think I'm alone. And yeah, they're coming from everywhere. They're coming from, places like The Guardian and NPR, and from very high echelons of society, as well as, herbalists and doctors and teachers. And it's been great and very affirming for people to say that my book got it right.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit about why it was hard to find material on CPTSD? I think it's got something to do with how we understand mental illnesses and how a mental illness kind of gains legitimacy.
Yeah, of course. It's not, complex PTSD is not in the DSM, which of course is the Bible of mental health. It is how we define what is real and what is not real. It defines treatment plans. It defines how psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists train to heal people with mental illness. It determines getting, like, insurance companies covering us and giving us the appropriate treatment. And it's not in the DSM. Only PTSD is in the DSM, and complex PTSD is a distinction they are not willing to make, which means getting treatment for it is really, really difficult because, you will be incorrectly diagnosed if you want treatment, and you probably get the wrong form of treatment. Most therapists don't know how to treat complex PTSD because it's not in the DSM, and there's not that much literature on it yet. There's a small handful of books. Again, most of them sort of drier and more scientific, most of them not actually written by people with complex PTSD, or just like not providing a first person narrative. And so my struggle to really find something that, I traded in first person stories. That's literally been my job for the past 12 years. Right. And so I know the power of it. I know how normalizing and humanizing and empathy building it is. And I just needed that so badly when I was first diagnosed. So set out to make it.
Yeah. You try in the book, you go through trying a bunch of different treatments. There's the one with the eyes. There was yin yoga, which I'm a huge fan of too. I just love stretching for a long time.
It's the best.
Can you tell me a little bit about that pursuit of treatment and how you kind of chronicled it? Almost like it felt a little bit like casting about in the dark, but also, you did have there were some lights along the way. It was therapy that got you a couple steps, maybe here and there. Can you start maybe to tell me about the eye one?
Yeah, EMDR.
EMDR.
EMDR, well, it is most commonly used with eyes in terms of like you go and you sort of recount your most painful traumatic incidents while moving your eyes back and forth in terms of looking at a moving light or a finger in front of your face. I felt more comfortable with my eyes closed. So I actually used buzzers and headphones that would buzz my hands left and right and beep in my ears. And the idea is that somehow this other stimulation allows you to not enter a triggered state and sort of be able to recount your traumatic incidents with more clarity, and with a different perspective, and then also to process them in terms of, sending an adult version of yourself back to help that child version. And it was really helpful for me in terms of understanding the horrors of what I went through, sort of like reliving some of the abuse that I suffered and recognizing how not okay it was. As well as learning to sort of comfort that deserving inner child. And I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet. I don't think there is any silver bullet, honestly, when it comes to complex PTSD, but it was certainly a really good, helpful first step in my healing process in terms of recognizing, I've been burying some pretty horrible stuff deep down that I'd minimized my entire life.
We've been talking a lot about trauma, about diagnosing trauma, treating trauma. And the book certainly deals with that, but it did something that I thought, I'm not sure I've seen it done before. And that's, it represented estrangement in a way that to me felt real. And also then took the reader beyond your personal experience and kind of gave an explanation of it. And I mean, it's particularly interesting. It's you and I are speaking in the middle of April. This episode will go out, probably days before Mother's Day. And I've been seeing this trend of, people post, Happy Mother's Day. And then there's now like a little, like a footnotey reference to like, oh, and even, for folks who maybe are having a tough time or don't have a great relationship with their mom or anything. So there's like this, people are just kind of beginning to grasp that this is a condition of some relationships. So maybe as a society, we're starting to get it a little bit. But I wanted to ask you, if you could kind of put into words, what is it we're still getting wrong about estrangement? Especially what are we getting wrong about it among folks who haven't experienced that kind of relationship?
Yeah. So I think estrangement is much more common than we previously thought. I think we don't talk about it as much, and it's really not studied very much academically at all, except for Christina Sharp and maybe a couple of more intellectuals. But I think that also estrangement is on a spectrum. It is not necessarily people who just haven't talked in 10 years. It's also people who like are actively trying to distance themselves from family members. And it's a weird thing that we don't talk about it so much, because when you start digging and you start asking people, so many families really are like, oh, we have an uncle that we don't ever talk about, or a grandfather, or I don't talk to my sister. And I think that not talking about it makes all of us who are in that situation feel a little bit more freakish and guilty, I think, too, that, I don't speak to either of my parents. And for the longest time, I felt horrible about it. In some ways, I still feel guilt over that. Because, your parents gave life to you. They gave so much to you to bring you up. And in my case, they brought me to America. They tried to build a good life for me. But there becomes a certain point at which those relationships can hurt more than they help.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a certain point at which I had to decide for myself, like, I deserve love. I deserve to be loved. And I don't deserve to be in a relationship with people who are constantly reminding me of how unloved I am. It's just, it took too much out of me. So yeah, I think normalizing that every year. I also post on Father's Day and on Mother's Day saying, like, hey, if you don't have a mom, if your mom isn't your blood mom, if you have mother figures in your life, reach out to them. But if you don't have anyone who's mothering you, feel free to stay off social media today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have to imagine, as you were writing this, because you are who you are and you've had the career you've had, you must have thought at some point this would work as a podcast, that there was an episodic, like, I'll do an hour on my personal history, and then I'll do an hour on, we'll do an hour on different treatments I sought. Why a book?
I just didn't have it in me. I was just too burnt out. I mean, I quit my job because, I was in an abusive workplace, and I was just so burnt out from working in audio for so long. And I just wanted to make something on my own. And I wanted to, a book seemed like the safest, healthiest way for me to be able to work that out. And I liked the editing process a lot more as well. For a podcast, I would have, a team of like 5 people going over every word minutely in multiple drafts. I'd have to play it out loud for them. And there was just something really peaceful and nice in writing it and working on it with just my editor or a few chosen people that I sent it to, and they read it in their own time and came back to me with notes. It was a lot better for my mental health.
That is a great note that I think anyone who's struggled through writing a book, and everyone I talk to about it usually says, like, oh my God, it's miserable, especially like the first book. Apparently what they need to do is first spend some years podcasting and doing audio editing, because that is so miserable.
It's so much worse. Yeah. Well, I think one of the important things too is I didn't really start writing the book until 2 years after diagnosis. So I was doing a lot of research, certainly, and I was doing all these treatments, but I was only writing journal entries. I was not writing with an audience. I would just go to a therapy session and then go to a cafe downstairs and just like do total stream of consciousness word vomit. And then I used all of those journal entries as, source material when I actually started writing it. But like the healing came first. The writing was not really my catharsis at all. Right. The healing was my catharsis. And that was really important because, like I said, I had tied up my self-worth in accomplishment and achievement so much over the years, that when it came to heal, it couldn't be tied to this creative project or success. You know what I mean? It just needed to be for me purely.
Yeah. So it wasn't just a drive to unseat the body keeps the score from its perch.
My entire healing process? No.
I mean,
it was for me.
The book, I mean, the healing process is for you. The book, though, could be a form of bookstore artillery to,
I will put it this way. If the body keeps the score is going to be years long national bestseller, perhaps it shouldn't be accompanied by a book written by a survivor of complex PTSD and a woman of color.
Yeah. And I'll say for listeners confused by this, The Body Keeps the Score it has this position as like the go-to on trauma. It's written by a Bessel van der Kolk, who was fired from his job as executive director of the trauma center following allegations of creating an abusive environment. So that's what we're talking about here. It's not an ideal figure to be at the top of the ladder of expertise on the topic of trauma.
Yeah, I think it's complex. I don't know him personally. I've never spoken to him. I know people who are big fans. I know people who worked with him who not big fans. So I don't really know the exact situation there. But again, like, I just think it's really important that there is more literature on complex PTSD because it needs more nuanced portrayals. Like depression or anxiety have lots of literature on them, and they have really nuanced. There's so many celebrities or successful people or, unsuccessful. Like, depression is not just one thing, one person, one monolithic thing. It is nuanced, and people with complex PTSD are just as diverse. I mean, everyone on this earth suffers some form of trauma, and certainly every culture, every kind of person suffers from complex PTSD. So,
you mentioned a moment ago that healing was sort of the precursor to writing the book, but I also found it really interesting that in the book you don't kind of present yourself as finished and healed. You really convey a sense of committing to, this is an ongoing process. You're not done. There's no bow that gets tied on it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true for complex PTSD, definitely, because, a trigger for me is loss, abandonment, right? And I will never stop experiencing that in my whole life because we are not immortal. And like, I'm sure I will continue to lose and be abandoned by people my whole life. And I'm going to need to deal with that in different situations. If I have kids, there's going to be all these new relationships and new nuances I'm going to have to manage. It's very much a relational trauma, and like, relationships are always changing and evolving and requiring new things of us. But I think not outside of complex PTSD, if any of us just think that we're done learning or growing, then we clearly have more learning and growing to do, right? Like, the painful process of being a human being on this earth requires constant adaptation.
Though you were determined not to write a book and not a podcast, I have to wonder though. I actually read it as an audiobook. I listened to you read it to me. Which is always the weird experience because I have to remind myself, just because I've spent 10 hours with this person, they haven't spent 10 hours with me.
Yeah. It must be weird.
It's very strange. I believe Michelle Obama and Salman Rushdie are my close personal friends. To name just a couple. But I wanted to ask about if you were thinking about the audiobook as you made it, because there's a section where you have these wonderful recordings with your therapist, Dr. Ham. And I mean, first of all, the recordings are wonderful. The insight you had to work out an arrangement where you could record is beautiful. And the way you incorporate it into the text is just lovely. It's just so natural and flowing. And I just love Dr. Ham.
He's the best.
I found him such a compelling character. Spoke. Tell me a little bit about those sessions. I assume you had tons of tape to go through to get these little nuggets that you worked into the narrative.
Yeah, I think I had like 30 hours of tape or something like that. Though probably like actually more like 15 that was usable. And then, well, I mean, I didn't, when I was writing the book, I did not write it with a radio producer's ear. I mean, I guess I probably did because I'm a radio producer and I wrote the book like a radio producer, but like, I mean, I wasn't thinking about the audiobook. Let's put it that way when I was writing. But I was certainly scouring through all of that tape and re-listening to a lot of it, rereading it to sort of retell that story of what being in that room was like. And I, of course, still had all of the Google Doc transcripts where me and Dr. Hom, so I would transcribe, I would record all the sessions, transcribe them immediately after, put them in a Google Doc, and me and Dr. Hom would go through and mark them up. So I still have those saved in the Google Docs of him and me sort of breaking down everything in these transcripts and us sort of fighting it out in the comments a lot. And it was wonderful. It was such a great experience, honestly. And sometimes when I'm really struggling, I'll go back and I'll go re-listen to some of my old therapy sessions. I think it's kind of like going to go back for free. I get to keep relearning these lessons over and over. And I think a lot of people say that seems terrifying. And I've heard people be like, I would never do that. I would never re-listen to my therapy sessions. And I'm like, no, I felt very cared for in those therapy sessions. When we went over them in Google Docs, I was able to take like this very radio producery stance on it and like edit my trauma out in this sort of it's like my trauma triggered brain turned off and just my like dissociated work brain turned on, but it was really helpful in that way. Because I could just see my foibles objectively and work through them. And yeah, I also just think that a lot of times they're funny and we have like a really nice little rapport going on where he'll call me stupid and we'll make fun of each other and stuff. So it was a delight to write that section of the book. Honestly, it was barely edited. The version that exists is almost like identical to my first draft.
It reads marvelous. It's a delight to read. It's a delight to listen to. I want to thank you, Stephanie, for joining us on Kobo in Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a fun conversation.
I have been speaking with Stephanie Foo, author of What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma. You'll find it at Kobo in Conversation's home on the web. That's kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen. Kobo in Conversation is produced by me, and also this time hosted by me, Nathan Maharaj. Michael Tamblin will be back soon. Don't you worry. And thank you for listening.